That's an interesting point that, to talk about the fiduciary role of Spotify, because Spotify is a publicly traded company, right? So people own stocks. So they have obligations to investors, of course.
So let me make an important point right there, because people in my comments like to do this too. The board still has a fiduciary role, even if it's closely held. The public just means it's a bigger group of people. So you still have an obligation to your investors. If it's just you,
Yes.
you can screw over your obligation to yourself because no one's going to sue you over it. But there are a lot of close corporations, including in my book of business, people that I represent that have, 20, 30 investors. And we have to have the talk with those boards all the time about fiduciary obligations and say, no, you can't buy a boat for your lake house with this. And two, you have obligations to that guy over there that gave you money. He gave you money to do this thing, not that thing. And I know that, but it's something that I think people get really stuck on. Well, if it's not a public corporation, they can do anything. No, they can if they have total unanimity amongst their management and their ownership. But most companies don't get to a place where we would care about them in the news at that level without some kind of outside investment. That's all I want to say.
That's a very good point. And I'm really glad that you pointed that out, because it's true. Anytime that you have somebody that is handling anyone else's money, regardless of the amount, regardless of what proportion of the overall fund belongs to somebody else, anytime you have somebody that is handling any amount of someone else's money, they have fiduciary responsibilities to that person or to that investment or to, what have you. So we could be talking about, a family trust that's like 3 people.
Sure. And you see the lawsuits that come out of those when they go wrong. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Those I've seen a number of those, so, as soon as you have, one person, Britney Spears is another example. You've got her dad handling her money. That's one person that he was responsible to. And now he's got potentially has some issues, coming from her and from her legal team. So, the story is still being written, but we'll see how that goes. But that's just one example, right? So Spotify does have a responsibility to its investors to make certain choices, right? As controversy arises.
Yeah, they have to evaluate, certainly.
Exactly. So number one, one thing that we can look at this is the fiduciary responsibility of Spotify to the investors over, the value of the relative contracts, right? Or the value of the relative IP. Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, these folks are their audiences tend to be a bit older. Spotify's overall audience tends to be much younger, and that audience tends to gravitate towards people like Joe Rogan. So, the actual audience of people that are on Spotify, that's something to take into account. Now, another thing to take into account is, when you start to have, as you said, that it was kind of surprising when you had multiple people kind of coming up and saying, yeah, me too, to join in with Neil Young, that then it starts to look like, well, is this now a wave of people that are starting to come up? And, and will there be more behind them, and will they have more star power, and will they be, geared towards a younger audience? Like, is this going to start a whole, movement potentially? So then that's another consideration that they would have to have in this sort of fiduciary role. And I think that, at least in my opinion, I don't know if you disagree, Rick, but in my opinion, I think that Spotify actually played a relatively good response to this whole sort of situation.
Oh, I think they did what was expected of them. The only other aspect I would add to your list of things that they're concerned about, which we also saw them respond to, is there are notions of employee mutinies that you're seeing with cultural items and other things where the employees and management can get into fights. So when you talk about fiduciary responsibilities, you also have the responsibility to try to keep the ship moving in the right direction and holding together. And so you saw Spotify also make comments to its employees about what it will and won't do in these kinds of contexts. So I think they did that well. I do think there's a certain bifurcation, whether on a political axis or not, with how people are looking at how these platforms operate. And Spotify, as part of this, basically adopted what I'd describe as the Twitter/YouTube approach. They published a series of rules about what content can be on their service. And we could talk about the specifics there as much or as little as you want. So I think it's good in terms of corporate behavior. It's what's expected, nothing to complain
Yeah.
about from the investors. Whether or not what they did is an overall good to
Mm.
information flow, platform use, what we're seeing, the discussion of quote unquote misinformation. I have a video on virtual legality that talks about the fallacy of authoritative sources and talking about what YouTube was doing with elevating certain voices over others.
Right.
So I have philosophical issues with the concept of kind of putting your thumb on the scale of the battle of ideas as much as you see Spotify doing in response to this. But in terms of corporate law, lawyer, business answer, I think they did certainly what a tech company is expected to do, and nothing too terribly untoward. And like I said, as soon as Neil Young says it's me or Rogan, that's the easiest decision in the world.
Yes.
So it's not that Neil Young is a nobody. I saw that flash by in your comments. I'm not accusing him of being a nobody, but as Legalbytes has suggested, there is a certain difference in audience at Spotify. And
Yeah.
frankly, the contracts, to the extent they exist for actual content contributors, because it's pretty simple. You get a little money out and that's it. It's a little bit like working on YouTube, I think. That is a different relationship from we negotiated $100 million exclusivity contract.
Yeah.
And we committed money to that. And that contract is going to have specifics about how we get out of it. And so to me, it was a very easy thing. Spotify was clearly getting some heat from certain quarters. So they had this series of statements from there. We can question. I think they also said they're going to add I think what you probably see, what is probably right below this video right now, depending on how fast YouTube is, which is a statement that says effectively, don't listen to these people. We've got a
Probably.
hub of people you should listen to. Click that
Right.
link. Go visit YouTube's COVID hub. I'm sure it's great. But I get those warnings anytime I say it, regardless of whether I'm even talking about
Right.
COVID. So I think Spotify is committed to having those, algorithmically generated things pop up anytime anybody says anything. And we could talk philosophically about whether that's a good thing or not. But to me, I'm of two minds. Corporate lawyer, sure, that all makes sense. YouTuber, personality that does content and is dealing with all this stuff every day,
Yeah.
little less enthused.